What is up, amigos? Today we're going to have our first episode of our theory crafting series. We're going to be doing a few of these until the end of beta, and then we're going to start theory crafting more for higher level builds until the full release of D4. Today we're going to be going over my Druid Earthbender build. This build I think will be super interesting and fun to play. I'll actually be testing it live tomorrow on kick.com/fluffyamigo. So starting off, we have our basic skills. We are going to be taking Storm Strike. We're going to put a point in there. Enhanced Storm Strike, Fierce Storm Strike. Now, the idea with taking Storm Strike here is the mixture of damage reduction, plus we're able to spread vulnerable status effects with our Fierce Storm Strike. Now, the way that Storm Strike works, it says that it chains up to a certain amount of enemies and dealing percentage less damage each time it chains. We don't really care about the damage. What we care about is the damage reduction. After we deal damage, we have a 25% damage reduction for 3 seconds. And we don't know how many enemies it chains up to, but at minimum it's going to chain to at least 2. And that means we'll be able to spread vulnerable status a lot. For those who don't already know, applying vulnerable status to enemies makes them take 20% increased damage for X amount of time. In this case, it's 3 seconds. So again, since we don't really know, and since it's beta, we are only going to be putting 1 point into our basic skills. This could scale and chain up to, 10 enemies for all we know at 5 points, but we only have a limited amount of points to work with. Now moving on to our core skills. So we have 2 different things that we need to try and focus on here. One being AoE farming like dungeons, open world activities, and other activities like bossing. So, Landslide seems incredibly good for AoE farming. We are crushing, literally, groups of enemies between 2 pillars of earth. So grouping, crushing, moving, and normally for AoE farming, you don't want to be stationary too long. Your main objective is speed, and speed equals efficiency. From here, we move into Enhanced Landslide, which gives us another chance to immobilize enemies, just like Storm Strike. Now, the unique modifier that we have here is Primal Landslide. When you immobilize or stun an enemy, you gain a Terra Mote. Each enemy hit by Landslide consumes that Terra Mote, causing a guaranteed crit strike with 10% increased crit damage. Bosses always have up to 30% chance to grant a Terra Mote when hit. So, this right here is going to make sure that we are always going to be gaining and consuming Terra Motes when bossing. And we're always going to be critting. We're always going to be doing extra crit damage. This right here I think is going to be a boss killer. The other modifier, Raging Landslide, I will test this tomorrow. I don't think this is going to be as good as Primal, but I also don't think that this is going to be as good as Primal for AoE farming either. I don't think an additional pillar is going to really help when we're just guaranteed critting, when we're always immobilizing and always gaining those Terra Motes. So, 5 points in the Landslide, 1 point in Enhanced, 1 point in a Primal. On to our defensives. Now, Druids have some of the best defensive skills in the game. I don't even know what the best option would be, because Earthen Bulwark, Cyclone, and Bloodhowl are all insane in their own way. To me, I'm leaning towards Cyclone Armor. And yes, this is the OG Cyclone Armor, and my fellow D2 players' Cyclone Armor is back and arguably better than ever. Diablo 4 Cyclone Armor grants us a passive 20% base non-physical damage reduction. So the key phrase here is non-physical. This means 20% elemental damage reduction, and maybe even dot damage. Anyways, this is pretty huge, and based off of the website, we don't know what this scales with if we want to put 5 points into here. So for now, we're going to only put 2 in. Now, as if the base skill wasn't already, in my opinion, overpowered a bit, let's go ahead and talk about the modifiers. So Enhanced Cyclone Armor in its own is actually pretty good too. So Cyclone Armor actually has an active effect. When we activate Cyclone Armor, which is on a 15-second cooldown, we knock back enemies. With Enhanced modifier, those knockback enemies are also slowed for 40%. Then we move on to the big one, Preserving Cyclone Armor. Every 10 seconds, when we're taking incoming damage, Cyclone Armor intensifies, granting us a 40% damage reduction for X amount of time. That is 40% global damage reduction every 10 seconds when we're in combat. For our companions, we aren't taking wolves, we aren't taking ravens. Instead, we're going to be taking 1 point in the Vine Creeper. And although the passive is nice, it poisons enemies over 6 seconds. Every 7 seconds, it poisons enemies. We use this primarily for the active effect. Vines strangle all surrounding enemies, immobilizing them for 2 seconds. This is a massive AoE crowd control. Now, this is where we have an option. We can take an extra second on that immobilization duration, or we can just put another point in the Cyclone. I will be putting another point in the Cyclone Armor, which allows us to move down into our Wrath skills. So this is where I thought it gets interesting. And most of the testing is going to be in the Wrath section. I'm definitely going to be putting a point in the Hurricane and one into Enhanced Hurricane to get a guaranteed 2-second slow every time an enemy is hit by my Hurricane. So anybody who played Diablo 2, we know Hurricane is going to be a giant circle around us. We don't know how big, obviously. But the biggest thing that we need to know is that it's not as long. It is only an 8-second duration on Hurricane. Now, you can spec into this later on with Endless Tempest. And later on, I mean like later, after beta for full release, when we have more points to work with. Right now, it's definitely not worth it. So yeah, it lasts 8 seconds, 20-second cooldown. It's not as good as Diablo 2 Hurricane, but that doesn't mean it's not good at all. Any enemy that hits us is slowed by 25% for 2 seconds. So the idea of this build is to basically never get hit. We're always CCing, we're always slowing, we're always stunning. So now we're going to move into the core abilities of the build. We're going to be taking these passive nodes over here. We're going to be taking 3 points in the Crushing Earth, which allows our Earth skills to deal 15% increased damage to enemies that are crowd controlled. Every one of our abilities has crowd control potential, so this will be a huge uptime for passive percent damage increase. We're going to be taking 1 point in the Safeguard. This ensures us that we gain a fortified percentage based of our max life every time we crit. So that means every time we crit, it's going to be pretty often because we're always going to be gathering these Terra modes, hitting an enemy with Landslide, and getting crit. With Stone Guard, which we are going to be putting 2 points into, when we have 50% or more fortify over our max life, we're going to be dealing an additional 8% increased damage. So the idea is to constantly CC. We're going to be gathering Terra motes from hidden enemies when they're CC'd. We're going to be consuming Terra motes with our Landslide to constantly crit, to gain fortified percentage, to always have an 8% increased damage. Now moving on to our ultimate skills. So we have 2 options here, one for bossing and one for just your generic AoE farming. The bossing one is going to be Petrify. Petrify allows you to encase all nearby enemies in stone, stunning them for 3 seconds. You deal 25% increased crit damage. Against bosses, the crit strike damage bonus is increased to X% and its duration is increased to X amount of time. So this means that we can just stack everything else up. We'll be applying vulnerable status with our Storm Strike, that's 20% increased damage. We'll be CCing them for an extra 15% damage with our Crushing Blows. We'll be consuming our Terra modes to guarantee a crit and an extra 10% crit damage. I really do believe that this build will destroy bosses. I really do believe when you encounter Butcher with this build, Butcher will melt. Again, I'll be testing all of this tomorrow. Cataclysm, the AoE spell that I was talking about, is one of the lengthier cooldown ultimates in the game. It allows you to create a storm that follows you for 8 seconds, knocking back enemies, lightning strikes. I just think it's a nice AoE clear. So there is another option in our Wrath spells that I do want to go over real quick. Instead of putting a point in the Hurricane and 2 points in the Stone Guard, we would remove these, put 1 point in the Stone Guard, 1 point in the Trample, Enhanced Trample, and Natural Trample. So, this is legendary power specific. Over here, there's going to be a Codex of Power called Aspect of the Trampled Earth. Trample now summons a number of landslide pillars of Earth during its duration that deal X amount of damage. Trample is now also a nature magic and earth spell. So it's going to scale with any earth damage that we have. Like this. Crushing Earth. But the big thing here is that this actually, every time we cast Trample, will allow us to hit the 50% Fortify mark faster. Once I get this legendary power, I believe this is what I'll be using over Hurricane. Trample is a lower cooldown. It's a big AoE knockback. And if you knock them back into terrain, they take increased damage and stun for 3 seconds. I don't know if landslide pillars count as terrain, but it's something I want to try and do. I want to try and trample, knock enemies back into my landslide for an additional combo. So a quick overview, we're going to be applying this vulnerable status effect with our basic Storm Strike attack. We won't have to worry about this much when we get to farming and, leveling. This will be great to be able to apply to multiple enemies. Landslide will be our main spender, but make sure you're always CCing something before spamming it to gain our extra bonuses, stack our terror modes, consume them. While leveling, we'll be able to benefit from this early on as Storm Strike and Landslide both have a chance to immobilize. The Cyclone passive is going to be amazing, especially for leveling early on. In my written guide, I actually have a level, when to choose when, level 1 to 25. Vine Creeper, make sure that we're only using this for our massive AoE CC capability. Do not waste this for nothing. Keep Hurricane up off cooldown, especially on bosses when it's just constant CC for constant uptime on Crushing Earth. Always make sure that we are keeping our Fortify up. The main goal is never to get hit. I know that's harder than it sounds sometimes, but between all our CC, Hurricane, it should be relatively easy. And don't forget to respec Petrify and Cataclysm when needed between AoE clear and between bossing. So on screen, I'll actually have a list of stats that you want to be looking for, both offensive affixes and defensive utils. So I did go over these quite a bit. These are personal opinion. If you think that these are wrong or maybe something on the bad list should definitely be on the, the good list, go ahead and just comment down below. I'll have a link to the written guide in the description down below so you can see the leveling process, what I'll be choosing per level. Alright, so that is it for this build. I'll be looking at making some other builds for this weekend's beta test. If you've enjoyed this, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe to the channel for additional Diablo 4 content. I'll be streaming tomorrow over at kick.com/fluffyamigo once servers come up, and I hope you all enjoy testing out Druid and Necro tomorrow during the open beta.